Your infrastructure is a digital museum, not a hospital system. It's embarrassing. My COO said this with the kind of smile that people practice in mirrors. He was 33 years old, had never spent a single night on call during a system outage at a level 1 trauma center, and was calling the network I'd spent 22 years building a network that processed 4.2 million patient records across 6 campuses embarrassing. That was 8 weeks ago. This morning, his parking badge stopped working. Mine didn't. Let me back up. My name is David Mercer. I'm 54 years old, and until recently I was the Chief Infrastructure Officer at Hargrove Regional Health Network, a mid-size hospital system in the Midwest that had been treating patients since 1971. I joined them in 2001, when the entire IT department was 3 guys sharing a single server room the size of a walk-in closet. By the time my COO decided I was obsolete, our network handled everything from emergency room triage routing to Medicare billing compliance across 6 hospitals, 2 urgent care chains, and a network of specialty clinics that stretched across 4 counties. When my COO fired me during a Microsoft Teams call on a Wednesday afternoon, not even a Friday, a Wednesday, like he couldn't wait. I had a mortgage with 11 years left, a wife in the middle of a certification program she'd put off for 20 years, and a younger brother in assisted living whose monthly costs I covered because he had no one else. I did the math in real time while my COO talked about organizational restructuring and resource efficiency. The math was not good, but here's what he didn't know. When he leaned back in his ergonomic chair and started talking about building a future-focused organization, I wasn't just the guy who built their systems. I was the only person legally authorized to operate them. Not practically, not organizationally, legally. And the difference between those 2 words was about to cost him the job he'd been so proud of landing. Back in 2001, when Hargrove was small enough that the CEO knew every employee by name, I negotiated something unusual into my consulting agreement before I transitioned to full-time staff. My attorney at the time, a meticulous man named Gerald who had the energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed reading federal regulations, had been watching what happened to hospital IT people who built compliance systems and then got pushed out before proper handoffs. He'd seen it wreck careers and, more importantly, wreck hospitals. What Gerald added was a single paragraph buried in Exhibit C of my employment amendment. It designated me as the named responsible party under Hargrove's federal infrastructure grant, a $43 million CMS modernization award we'd received in 2003. That designation meant I was personally accountable to the federal government for the compliance architecture of every system the grant had funded. It also meant that federal regulations required a minimum 180-day written transition process before I could be removed from that role. No exceptions. No workarounds. The government doesn't negotiate transition timelines. Gerald had called it a parachute. I'd called it paranoid. I signed it anyway because Gerald had a perfect track record, and I had a bad feeling about healthcare administration politics even then. That clause sat in a filing cabinet in my home office for 22 years, waiting for someone confident enough to test it. My COO arrived at Hargrove 11 months before he fired me. The board had brought him in to lead a modernization initiative ahead of a planned merger with a larger regional system. He had an MBA from a school whose name he worked into conversation with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it thousands of times. He had a background in healthcare consulting that amounted to recommending things and then leaving before anyone could measure the results. He had the kind of unearned confidence that only comes from having been consistently rewarded for the appearance of competence rather than the substance of it. His first week, he called a leadership summit. Everyone got a printed agenda with his photo on the cover. He announced we were entering a transformation phase, that legacy thinking had to give way to cloud-native agility, that Hargrove needed to compete like a technology company that happened to heal people. He said this to a room full of nurses, physicians, compliance officers, and infrastructure engineers who had spent their careers making sure that people didn't die because a system went down at the wrong moment. I watched him from the back of the room and thought about every 3 a.m. call I'd taken when the pharmacy dispensing system threw errors. Every Saturday I'd spent in a server room while my family waited for me at a birthday party. Every hour I'd invested making sure that when a cardiologist in one of our rural clinics needed a patient's history at midnight, it was there, and it was right, and it was secure. He called all of that legacy thinking. He started small, the way people like him always do. Renamed our IT governance board the Digital Acceleration Council, replaced our quarterly compliance reviews with agile sprint cycles that no one with federal reporting obligations could actually operate within, hired a 27-year-old cloud architect from a tech startup who had never worked in a regulated healthcare environment and seemed genuinely surprised that patient data couldn't just be migrated to commercial cloud infrastructure without CMS approval. Then he started pulling my team leads into individual conversations. Coaching sessions, he called them. What he was actually doing was asking them detailed questions about our system architecture while suggesting that the old way of doing things was holding everyone's career back. I'd find them afterward looking unsettled, repeating things like he asked why we don't use continuous deployment or he wants to know if we really need a dedicated compliance validation environment. These were people I'd hired. People I'd trained in environments where the wrong configuration on a network segment could expose protected health information for 200,000 patients. And my COO had them second-guessing whether our 3-layer validation protocol was actually necessary or just the kind of thing an older generation did because they didn't know better. My calendar started thinning out. Merger planning meetings I'd attended for 6 months stopped, including me. The joint technical committee with the acquiring system sent calendar invitations to my team leads, but not to me. My COO started using phrases like, "We need fresh eyes on our infrastructure strategy, and it might be time for some new energy in the technical leadership." I didn't get defensive. I got organized. I pulled every piece of documentation I'd created over 22 years. System architecture diagrams predating his arrival by 2 decades. CMS audit correspondence going back to 2004. The federal grant agreement with Exhibit C attached. HIPAA compliance certifications listing me by name as the accountable officer for 6 of our 9 certified systems. Joint Commission accreditation documentation with my signature on the attestation forms. And then I called Gerald, who was semi-retired but still sharp enough that when I explained the situation, he went quiet for a moment and said, "Tell me you still have that employment amendment." "I have it right here." 11 seconds of silence. They have no idea what they're about to do they? "None." "Good, keep documenting, don't react, let them make the move." The call came on a Wednesday at 2:15 inches the afternoon. My COO had his camera on. His background was an artfully blurred open concept office. He had the expression of someone who had been looking forward to this conversation. He started with organizational evolution and the need to align leadership capacity with future state goals. He talked about restructuring the technical executive function and creating space for next-generation vision. He used the phrase right-sizing institutional knowledge, which is the kind of language that sounds sophisticated until you realize it means firing the people who actually know things. Then he got to it. "We're eliminating your position effective immediately. Your institutional contributions have been significant, but we need to move forward with a different kind of technical leadership. And just so we're aligned, everything you've built here belongs to Hargrove. Your systems, your documentation, your frameworks, that's all organizational property." He said this the way people say it when they've been told to say it by legal counsel and have repeated it enough times that it no longer sounds like a threat to them. I looked at him for a moment without saying anything. I want you to remember that pause, because he was the one who broke it, with a small laugh and a comment about how change is hard for everyone. I said nothing. I closed the application. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table for 20 minutes doing nothing except thinking through next steps. Then I opened my laptop and emailed Gerald. "Gerald, they fired me today. No notice, no transition, no written process. Wednesday afternoon, by Teams call. They said everything I built is theirs. They have no idea about Exhibit C. I need you ready to move. Attaching the amendment now." His reply came back in 4 minutes. "I'm already drafting. This is going to be educational for everyone involved. Don't touch anything on their systems. Don't communicate with anyone there except through me. And David, get some sleep tonight. They won't sleep well for the next several weeks." Let me explain what Exhibit C actually meant in practical terms, because my COO certainly hadn't read it and the board was about to learn what happens when you don't read things. When Hargrove received the federal CMS modernization grant in 2003, the government required that someone be personally designated as the compliance steward for the infrastructure being funded. That person had to be named in the grant agreement, had to maintain active certification in federal healthcare IT compliance standards, and could not be removed from the role without a formal documented transition period of 180 days minimum with written federal notification. I was that person. I had been that person for 20 years. My certifications were current because I renewed them every 2 years without fail. My name was on $43 million of federal infrastructure as the responsible human being. When my COO fired me on a Wednesday afternoon with no notice, no written process, and no federal notification, he didn't just breach my employment agreement. He triggered a compliance violation that federal auditors took very seriously. He also, as Gerald was in the process of documenting, transferred 0 intellectual property to Hargrove's ownership because the work product produced under a federal grant has its own legal designation that is considerably more complicated than it belongs to the employer. Gerald sent the initial correspondence the following Monday. It was addressed to the board chair, the CEO, the general counsel, and my COO. The subject line read, Notice of Federal Compliance Obligation and Unauthorized Removal of Designated Responsible Party. It was 9 pages. It cited 4 separate federal regulations, 2 CMS policy documents, and the specific language of Hargrove's grant agreement. The final paragraph noted that as of the date of my termination, Hargrove was in active violation of federal compliance requirements, that this violation would be reportable to CMS under mandatory disclosure obligations, and that the estimated exposure in grant clawback, civil monetary penalties, and HIPAA breach liability from the transition disruption was somewhere between $38 and $62 million depending on audit findings. It also included an invoice. Gerald was precise about it, not a round number. The actual calculation of licensing fees for the certified compliance architecture that had reverted to my ownership upon improper termination, plus transition disruption liability, plus what Gerald called federal coordination costs. The total was $1,944,212. He attached a schedule showing exactly how each line was calculated. There was no ambiguity. I'm told my COO received the letter while he was in a merger planning meeting and went pale enough that someone asked if he needed water. He did not need water. He needed to have read his own organization's legal documents before making personnel decisions. I found out later that his initial reaction was to dismiss it. He told the general counsel it was a legal bluff from a disgruntled former employee and that these things always resolve themselves. He told the CEO they had strong legal grounds to contest the designation. He told the merger planning team there was no material risk to the transaction timeline. He said all of this without having actually reviewed the federal grant agreement. The problem started the following Thursday. Hargrove's cloud architect, the 7-year-old who'd been brought in to modernize our infrastructure, had been working for 2 weeks on migrating our primary clinical data warehouse to a commercial cloud platform. He'd been given approval by my COO to move forward on an accelerated timeline to demonstrate transformation momentum ahead of the merger board meeting. What the cloud architect didn't know, because no one had told him and the documentation he'd been given was incomplete, was that the clinical data warehouse was built on a certified architecture with specific data residency requirements tied to our federal grant compliance. You could not simply migrate it to commercial cloud infrastructure. There was a reason that infrastructure existed where it existed and was configured the way it was configured. I knew that reason. I had written it down in approximately 400 pages of technical documentation that my COO had described as legacy bureaucracy. When the migration completed and the warehouse went live on commercial infrastructure, 3 things happened in quick succession. Our primary EHR vendor's integration interface threw authentication errors because the new environment didn't match the certified configuration it expected. Our automated HIPAA audit logging stopped generating compliant records because the logging architecture assumed on-premise infrastructure. And CMS's automated compliance monitoring system, which pinged our infrastructure quarterly to verify grant compliance, generated an alert that our certified systems were no longer responding from their registered configuration. That last one triggered an automatic notification to the Federal Compliance Office. By Monday morning, Hargrove had received written notice from CMS that their compliance status was under expedited review. All grant disbursements Hargrove was still receiving ongoing funding under the original grant's maintenance provisions were placed on administrative hold pending resolution. The Joint Commission, which had been notified by CMS as part of standard interagency protocol, opened a preliminary inquiry into the accreditation status of 3 of our certified facilities. The merger partners' due diligence team, which had been in the middle of finalizing transaction documents, requested an emergency call with Hargrove's board to understand the nature of the federal inquiry before proceeding. That call did not go well. I heard about all of this through my former executive assistant, who had worked with me for 11 years, and who texted me on a Tuesday night with a message that said it's really bad here and I hope you're okay. I told her I was fine and that I hoped she was hanging in there. She replied, "They're asking if anyone knows how the compliance logging architecture works." "No one does." I replied, "I know." She said, "I know you do." Gerald called me the next morning. "The board wants to talk." I told them the only conversation that matters is through me, and it needs to include an acknowledgement of the compliance violation and a proposed remedy. They're ready to have that conversation. They also want to discuss your return. I let 2 days pass before I responded. The meeting with the board chair and the general counsel happened by video call on a Friday morning. My COO was not invited to that call, which told me everything I needed to know about where things stood. The board chair, a physician who had been with Hargrove for 30 years and who had personally hired me back in 2001, looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "David," he said, "we owe you an apology. A significant one. We made decisions that were short-sighted and frankly disrespectful of everything you've contributed." He paused. "We want to make this right. We'd like you to come back and help us resolve the federal situation, and we'd like to discuss a long-term arrangement that reflects your actual value to this organization." I appreciated the apology. I told him so. And then I explained the terms. I would return as an independent consultant, not an employee. My compliance, architecture, and documentation framework would remain my intellectual property, licensed to Hargrove under a renewable monthly agreement with terms I set and Gerald reviewed. Any changes to systems covered under the federal grant required my written approval before implementation. My consulting rate was $1,200 per hour for active engagement, and my monthly retainer for the licensing arrangement was to be determined by Gerald's calculation of fair market value. The federal notification and CMS reconciliation would happen under my direction, on my timeline. The board chair was quiet for a moment. "Those are significant terms. They're appropriate terms," I said. "Given the situation." He nodded slowly. "I think we understand that now." The compliance resolution took 11 weeks. I will not pretend it was simple. Unwinding the migration, restoring the certified configuration, generating the documentation CMS required to close the inquiry, coordinating with Joint Commission reviewers, preparing the mandatory disclosure filing. It was the most technically demanding work I had done in years. There were days when I was on calls from 7 in the morning until 9 at night, but I did it as myself. On my terms. With Gerald reviewing every agreement before I signed it and with an hourly meter that was very much running. My COO was gone by week 3. No announcement, no farewell message on the company intranet. His LinkedIn profile updated quietly, the Hargrove position replaced with a vague consultancy description and a post about embracing new challenges. The merger planning team told me privately that his departure had been a condition of the transaction proceeding. The acquiring organization had done their own review of how the compliance situation had developed and reached conclusions that made my COO's continued involvement in the combined entity untenable. The cloud architect stayed on, which I thought was right. He was a capable technician who had been given bad direction by someone who didn't understand the environment. Once someone explained why the certified architecture existed the way it did, he understood it immediately. He asked good questions. He was genuinely interested in learning. He reminded me of myself at 27, minus the institutional context that takes time and difficulty to accumulate. One afternoon, while we were working through the recertification documentation, he stopped and asked me something I hadn't expected. "Why didn't you warn them more forcefully when you saw what was happening?" I had thought about this question. I had a real answer. I told them, formally, in writing, with technical documentation. 3 separate times in the 9 months before my termination, my COO acknowledged the communications and told me that my risk assessments reflected legacy thinking and an over-calibration toward caution. He wasn't interested in being warned. He was interested in being right. The cloud architect absorbed that. What if the migration had exposed patient data? What if it had been worse than compliance paperwork? That was the question I had asked myself during the weeks before my termination, when I was watching the changes happen in real time. The honest answer was that I had made a judgment call. The certified architecture had enough built-in redundancy that a migration to unauthorized infrastructure would generate compliance failures before it generated data exposure. The logging would break before the encryption did. I had designed it that way deliberately, back in 2003, because I had always understood that systems need to survive human error, including the errors of the people managing them. But I told him what I tell anyone I mentor now. That judgment call was mine to make because I knew the system. The lesson isn't that you should let bad decisions play out to prove a point. The lesson is that you should build systems robust enough to fail safely, document your warnings clearly enough to be unambiguous, and make sure you understand your own position before someone else decides to define it for you. He nodded. He asked if I had any advice for someone early in their career. "Read every agreement you sign," I said. "Understand what you're actually building and who it serves. And when someone tells you that the careful approach is the old-fashioned approach, ask them what happens if they're wrong." He thought about that. "And if they fire you for asking, then you want." The merger closed 6 months after my return. The acquiring organization's CTO, a careful woman who had built her career through actual engineering rather than organizational politics, spent 2 days with me reviewing the compliance architecture before her team would sign off on the transaction. She had questions I hadn't been asked in years. Good ones. Specific ones. Questions that showed she understood what she was looking at. On the second afternoon, She leaned back and said, "Your documentation is extraordinary. This is 20 years of institutional knowledge. How would you feel about serving as technical advisor to the combined entity?" I told her that would depend on the terms. She smiled. Of course it would. We reached an agreement 2 weeks later. Gerald negotiated it. I reviewed every paragraph. It was signed by 4 executives, which felt about right. My brother called me the week the merger closed. He'd been following the situation from a distance, asking periodic updates during our Sunday calls. He wanted to know how I was feeling about everything. I told him I felt fine. Better than fine, actually. He asked if I was glad I'd fought back. I thought about that for a second. I told him that I wasn't sure fight was the right word. Fighting implies that the outcome was in doubt. I had spent 22 years building something that worked, documenting it so it could be understood, and protecting it legally because I had good counsel early on. When someone decided that work was worthless, the work disagreed. I just made sure there was a mechanism for the work to say so. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know, most people don't think to do that. Most people don't have a Gerald," I said. He laughed. "There's a broader thing I've thought about since all of this happened. Something that goes past the specifics of my situation. Healthcare organizations, and I suspect this is true in a lot of industries, have a recurring problem with confusing confidence for competence. The people who sound certain tend to get resources. The people who say it's complicated tend to get questioned. The people who build the things that work, quietly, over years, in unglamorous compliance with regulations that exist for serious reasons, tend to get called obstacles to innovation. The irony is that the systems those people build are usually the only thing standing between the confident-sounding people and the consequences of their decisions. My compliance architecture didn't fail. My COO failed. But because my architecture didn't fail, the hospital's patients never knew there was a risk. They just showed up, got treated, and went home. Which was always the point. That's the thing that gets lost in transformation initiatives and modernization roadmaps. The value of a system that works isn't visible. It looks like nothing, because nothing went wrong. The only time you understand what you actually had is when someone removes it without understanding it, and then you find out very quickly and very expensively what nothing going wrong was actually worth. My COO never understood that. He looked at 22 years of careful, compliant, redundant infrastructure and saw a museum. He didn't understand he was standing in a building that had been earthquake-proofed. You don't see earthquake-proofing. You see an older building. You think, why wasn't this designed to be modern? You don't think, this is why everyone inside is still alive. 2 months after the merger, I got a connection request on LinkedIn from my former COO. I did not accept it. Not out of bitterness genuinely. I hold very little bitterness about what happened. The situation resolved in a way that was fair and, in some respects, more favorable than what I'd had before. I declined because I had nothing to gain from the connection and some things to say to him that I didn't think served anyone's interests to say. I wrote the message in my head once, sitting on my back porch with coffee on a Saturday morning. I didn't send it. But I thought about what I would tell him if I were going to be useful rather than just accurate. I would tell him that the problem wasn't that he wanted to modernize. Modernization is legitimate. The problem was that he treated expertise as an obstacle rather than a resource. That when someone with 22 years in a specific environment tells you something is complicated, the correct response is to ask why, not to assume they're being resistant. That confidence without curiosity isn't leadership, it's just loudness. I would tell him that the people who built the things he wanted to replace had reasons for building them the way they did. Some of those reasons were outdated. Some of them were essential. The job was to know the difference. And the only way to know the difference was to learn before you acted, not to act and then find out. I would tell him that careers in leadership are long, and the places where you're the smartest person in the room and the places where you have the most to learn have a way of looking similar from the inside. But I didn't send it. I deleted the draft and finished my coffee. 11 months after my termination, the Combined Health Network received a favorable federal compliance review. Our systems were recertified. The grant status was fully restored with a notation in the file about the transition disruption and its resolution. The federal compliance officer who handled our case sent a brief note acknowledging the complexity of the situation and the thoroughness of the remediation documentation. I printed that letter. I put it in the same filing cabinet as Exhibit C. I'm still consulting for the network. I still maintain the compliance architecture I built. I still sit at my kitchen table on Tuesday mornings reviewing system documentation while my wife drinks her coffee across from me, working toward the certification she deferred for 2 decades and is now 4 months from completing. My brother is doing well. The mortgage has 8 years left. Every few months, someone sends me an article about healthcare, digital transformation, or an invitation to speak on a panel about legacy infrastructure modernization. I read the articles. I decline the panels. I have no interest in performing expertise. I am too busy practicing it. If there is one thing I would want someone to take from everything that happened, it would be this. Know what you've built, know what it's worth, and make sure someone besides you understands the difference between the two. Not because you're planning for betrayal, because knowledge without documentation is just memory, and memory walks out the door when you do. I've been in this field for 26 years. I have worked with a lot of people who were smarter than me, faster than me, more technically current than me. Some of them built things that lasted. Some of them built things that looked impressive and fell apart when they were actually needed. The difference, in almost every case, was not the technology. It was whether the person building understood what they were actually responsible for. My COO thought he was responsible for transformation metrics and merger optics. He was. But he was also, whether he knew it or not, responsible for the infrastructure that kept 6 hospitals running. He didn't know that. He never asked. He never read the grant agreement. He never looked at the Exhibit C attached to an employment amendment that had been sitting in a filing cabinet for 20 years waiting for someone to test it. That is not a mistake I will ever make. I read everything. I understand what I've signed. I know who is accountable for what, and I make sure that accountability is written down somewhere specific enough to matter. Gerald turned 71 this year. I sent him a case of the bourbon he likes. He called to thank me and mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd added a similar clause to 3 other clients' agreements after hearing how mine had gone. I told him that seemed right. He said, "The best legal protection is the kind that works because everyone agrees it should, but holds up even when they don't." I told him that was also a good description of infrastructure. He laughed. "That's why we've always gotten along, David. We're both in the same business." I thought about that for a while after we hung up. He was right. The business is building things that keep working even when someone decides they shouldn't have to. The business is making sure that when you've done your job well for a very long time, that fact is somewhere in writing, in a format that a federal court can read.
They say just forget. Move on like it's easy. But forgetting you feels like remembering someone I've never seen. I've been trying to erase you from the places in my mind, but the harder that I fight it, the more you're hard to leave behind. Every memory keeps slipping through the cracks I try to close, like a face I should remember, but somehow never know. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Every moment turns to fragments, every thought just fades to blue, like I'm searching for a feeling that still only leads to you. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. If I never met you, maybe I would know just how to heal. But now every empty moment still reminds me what is real. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. feels like losing something true. Don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand on my own. I was broken by your leaving, fell deeper than I thought I would. But pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly, don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger. Now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection. Now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll learn to breathe again. So keep your sympathy behind you. I don't need what's left undone. Sometimes losing who once broke you is how healing has begun. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll rise alone again. I'll rise alone